In the introduction of All Quiet on the Western Front, readers meet young German soldier Paul Bäumer and his comrades, who are in the midst of fighting on the front lines in World War I. Paul and his friends from school enlisted in the war on the advice of their teacher, Kantorek, who insisted that it was a glorious and noble pursuit. The reality is much grimmer, and their day-to-day lives focus mainly on survival and dulling their emotions. In the rising action, Paul and company visit their dying comrade Kimmerich in the infirmary, who has had his leg amputated. Muller eyes his boots, a valuable commodity which Kimmerich will no longer need. He'll likely die soon. The men discuss their cruel training camp commander, Corporal Himmelstoss, who made their lives miserable by abusing his power. At one point, they recall, they took revenge on Himmelstoss by beating him. While constructing new fencing at the front, Paul's company falls under a French attack. They shield themselves in a cemetery while shells explode the coffins and corpses around them, forcing them to hide under the dead bodies of fellow soldiers. The depictions of the above-ground battles with the French are gruesome. These ordeals force the soldiers to emotionally detach from what they are experiencing in order to stay calm and survive. After a number of devastating battles, 3/4 of Paul's company are killed, though Paul and his friends survive. The men are relieved from the front lines after suffering catastrophic losses, and soon Paul and his friends encounter some French women on the other side of the canal who invite them over to share food and romantic companionship. Paul is given a 17-day leave to go home, and once there, recognizes how truly alienated he is from his family and civilian life. He finds that he can't discuss the horrors of the war, and that nothing from his old life gives him pleasure anymore. He feels utterly lost and alone, worried he'll be unable to live a normal life once the war ends. After his leave is over, Paul remains in the training camp for a month, where part of his duties include guarding Russian prisoners. Paul feels compassion for them. When Paul returns to the front lines, his company is again attacked. A French soldier falls on Paul while he's hiding in a shell hole. In the climax of the novel, Paul kills a man face to face for the first time when he stabs the Frenchman, who slowly dies over the next day, causing Paul to feel remorse for the man's suffering. In the falling action, Paul and his friend Kropp are injured while guarding an abandoned village. While hospitalized, Kropp's leg is amputated. Paul is able to recover and returns to the front lines where the Germans are losing the battle. Many of Paul's remaining friends are killed, experience mental breakdowns, or are captured as they try to desert. In the novel's resolution, Paul is killed on a quiet day on the Western Front, only a month before the war ends. All Quiet on the Western Front's central characters are protagonist Paul Bäumer, members of his platoon, and problematic authority figures. Paul Bäumer is 19 years old and the narrator of the novel, telling of his experiences in World War I in the present tense. He enlisted in the German army right out of high school after being told it was the patriotic thing to do. As he witnesses the atrocities and inhumanity of the war, he grows increasingly alienated and detached from his own emotions in order to survive. He can't comprehend a future for himself or his comrades, even if they survive the war. At the same time, he cares deeply for his friends and feels bonded to them throughout all they've endured together. Stanislaus Kat Kaczynski, 40 years old, is one of Paul's closest friends, as well as a mentor figure, because he's older than Paul and his friends. He's clever and resourceful, a cobbler who's able to cobble together food and supplies when the soldiers need them most. He and Paul bond closely, and Paul takes his death the hardest. Albert Kropp is the character most interested in debating and analyzing the causes of the war and its repercussions. He's wounded in battle and his leg is amputated, causing him to grow increasingly withdrawn and bitter, and even suicidal. Friedrich Müller is the most pragmatic of Paul's fellow soldiers. For example, he's the first to claim fellow soldier Kimmerich's boots as Kimmerich lay dying. He often wonders what he and his comrades will do after the war ends. After Müller's death, Paul inherits the boots. Schaden is constantly hungry and obsessed with food and resources throughout the novel. He was tormented by Corporal Himmelstoss during boot camp training because he had a bedwetting accident and thus harbors a deep grudge against him. Corporal Himmelstoss is first encountered by the soldiers during their training. where he makes their lives miserable by tormenting them. Previously a postman in civilian life with little authority, he takes advantage of his power during war, abusing it at every turn. However, after he experiences the brutality of front lines, he feels badly and attempts to befriend the soldiers. Paul later believes Himmelstoss's harsh treatment of the men sufficiently toughened them up for battle. Cantoric is a teacher enamored with the chivalrous, duty-bound jingoism of war, who inspires his students to enlist in the war as their patriotic duty. After fighting in the war, Paul and his friends see how little Cantoric really knew about actual combat because his knowledge of war was so abstract. Far from a mentor, he set the wheels in motion to destroy the young men's lives. Weapons, butterflies in nature, food, and Kemeric's boots and clothing. Whether commonplace or instruments of war, these are the key symbols in All Quiet on the Western Front. World War I marked a considerable change in the way wars were fought, especially involving weapons. For the most part, men did not fight in hand-to-hand combat as was common in earlier wars. With the advent of machine guns, hand grenades, tanks, gas warfare, bombs, and airplanes, the soldiers fought from trenches to protect themselves. The new weaponry was designed to annihilate large numbers of men at one time, and carried the additional effect of causing psychological damage. The soldiers knew they lived by chance alone. Any incoming bomb may or may not harm them. The term shell shock was created to name the emotional condition that many of the survivors suffered. The novel includes imagery of nature, landscapes, animals, and butterflies and other insects on numerous occasions. Even on the front lines, Paul manages to notice geese flying over during a bombardment, butterflies, and the changing of the seasons. The butterflies represent innocence, happiness, and order within nature as they contrast with the observation balloons and the skulls that litter the battlefield. They also represent the fragility and vulnerability of human life during war. Paul describes the natural earth as holding and protecting the soldiers like a mother when they're forced to take cover in the trenches. But nature's not always kind. Sometimes it contributes to the soldiers' suffering. Storms, heat, and mud plague the soldiers. They must also contend with the dangers of rats and lice. Nature, like everything else in the novel, can be subject to the dictates of war. Food is obviously a primal human need. In the midst of horrific violence and death, references to food appear repeatedly in the novel as a reminder of the soldiers' need to survive, but also to find comfort and pleasure. Sharing a meal heightens their camaraderie, one of the last vestiges of their humanity. Good, nourishing food is often in short supply at the front, where it's rationed. Kemeric's boots and clothing are passed from one soldier to the next in an effort to defy death, since the boots outlive each owner. These boots come to represent the fleetingness of life. The practical notion of needing good boots during warfare supersedes the emotions one soldier might feel over the death of another. Other items of clothing are significant reminders of one of the human body's most basic needs, to be protected from the elements. Uniforms, including helmets and boots, represent the men's role in the military. Sometimes the uniforms protect the soldiers or help them do their jobs, but just as often they fail to protect them from the barrage of bullets and shells they encounter. The ownership or condition of pieces of clothing also symbolizes the soldiers' relationship to one another and their state of mind about the war around them. Modern warfare, the lost generation, patriotism, camaraderie, and empathy versus alienation are the themes that speak to the devastating effects of war in the landmark novel All Quiet on the Western Front. The theme of modern warfare connects to World War I's introduction of an arsenal of new, powerful weaponry, including mustard gas and machine guns, that could inflict carnage on a mass level. Previously, many literary works about war emphasized its idealistic aspects, such as honor, glory, and patriotism. All Quiet on the Western Front describes the unique physical effects of World War I in unsparing detail, with its numerous graphic descriptions of horrific conditions gruesome war wounds, and decimated corpses, as well as an unflinching depiction of the damaging psychological effects of war on its soldiers associated with war's modern terms. In the 1920s, American writer Gertrude Stein told Ernest Hemingway that he and other members of his generation who came of age during World War I were the lost generation. Paul worries often throughout the novel that his generation is irrevocably lost due to their experience in the war. He and his friends enlisted in the army straight out of high school, and their entire adult lives have been consumed by battle. They have no careers or families to return to when the war is over, and their experiences during the war guarantee that adjusting to civilian life will be difficult at best. Their future feels just as lost as their past. World War I begins in some ways as an act of patriotism, the idea that a national identity is tied to the individual identities of its people. And Paul, along with his friends, joined the army based on this idea as well. However, the horrors of war quickly subvert this idea of patriotism as the war becomes less and less about country and more about individual survival. In the end, Paul realizes that the real enemies are not the opposing soldiers, but the powerful governments that sacrifice individual soldiers over bids for power and glory. Camaraderie between Paul and his comrades is a ray of hope that keeps them going throughout the terrible horror, dehumanization, and death in the war. Their collective experiences bond them in an intense way that civilian friends and family can never touch or comprehend, because the majority of their shared experience is one of intense suffering and survival. Paul also experiences empathy for Russian prisoners, for a French soldier he kills, and for the patients in a military hospital. Empathy versus alienation are responses to the brutality of war the soldiers struggle with. Empathy, the ability to feel compassion for the suffering of others, and alienation, being cut off from the rest of humanity and from themselves, are perpetually evoked. Soldiers come to feel alienated from their families and their friends, and even their own identities, losing all hope for the future. Yet, there are flashes of empathy as soldiers befriend and look out for one another's welfare, and sometimes for the welfare of their enemies.